Welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I'm Tammy Takeishi, a board-certified music therapist. Join me each week as a new guest from across the fine and creative arts spheres shares struggles, triumphs, laughs, words of wisdom, and more in authentic, thought-provoking, and inspiring interviews. Hello and welcome to Creative Piecemeal. Today I'm joined by psychotherapist and author Sally McQuillen. She's got a new book out called Reaching for Beautiful, a memoir of loving and losing a wild child. Reaching for Beautiful is a luminous story of how love triumphs over pain, love transcends fear, and love never dies. This debut memoir from a mother grieving her young adult son's death is a must-read for any parent who has lost a child, is raising a child from the edge of their seat, or whose family struggles with addiction. When Sally's 21-year-old son died in a boating accident, her greatest fear is realized. Christopher was often drawn to risk and struggled with addiction. In this riveting memoir, she captures the wild ride of his jam-packed life and her deep love for him, while reflecting on her own childhood and family's legacy of alcoholism. Sally shares insights about what it's like to experience the emotional aftershocks of acute grief, filtered through the dual lens of her personal experience as a mother and her professional vantage point as a psychotherapist. Even if they have not been touched by loss in this way, readers may see themselves in Sally's bittersweet illusion of trying to keep her wild child safe, and how she is challenged to let go of her fear, guilt, and regret in order to forgive herself, and in the ways grief teaches her about the power of love. First of all, wow. Thank you for opening up your heart and pouring it out into this memoir to help others. Amazing.
Thank you, Tammy. So good to be with you this morning. And I am grateful. I'm getting so much gratification from being able to share Christopher's story and mine, and just hoping it comforts other people.
So you've have and had a career as a psychotherapist, but when it touches your own life, grief can feel quite different. So I think it's great that you were able to put it, like you said, in a dual lens. But what really inspired you to actually write the book?
Well, it's so interesting. I was reflecting back to writing, and I had loved to write in high school and gone on to major in writing in college. And yet I hadn't continued to write thereafter. And it was interesting to me that when Christopher passed, it was one of the first suggestions that someone made to me, and I seized on it because it is such an incredible means to express feeling, I think. And so part of me as a very feeling person wants to be able to make sense of those feelings. But the thing that probably drove me even more was that I was writing to Christopher. So I actually began, it was interesting. I began sort of doing these journal entries 21 days after he died and sharing with him how I was feeling. So that effort to connect with him and that desperation and yearning to know where he was and to feel as if he was still close, writing facilitated that.
I can only imagine it must have been really difficult to have to essentially relive it and put it on paper, but also perhaps cathartic.
So cathartic because, like I said, there's especially having lost a child traumatically. And I think oftentimes the loss of a child is inherently traumatic because it's out of time. In this case, it was by accident and unexpected, although I'd feared losing him because he was a wild child and had had probably three near-death accidents even before he passed. I still was completely unprepared for literally a part of my heart having felt like it left the world, and then I was just sent plummeting. So I needed something to help tether me. I was writing on my phone, Tammy, so it was sort of almost as if I was texting my son, which was one of the ways that I was in communication with him because he was otherwise hard to pin down, and after he died, I chuckled to myself because there had been a series of messages that I left on his phone, and I was fortunate enough to have access to his phone, and he'd never even received them, so he was just off and running and busy. This form of expression ultimately was so healing because I could do a number of things. I could capture his life, which I wanted to do. I was in my 50s when I lost him. Now I'm in my 60s. I wanted to sort of also hold fast to all of our memories. I also needed to reflect on every decision that I'd made and reconcile it, because one of the other hallmarks, I think, of any grief is the guilt that one feels. And as a mother who couldn't keep her child alive, I had quite a bit of guilt. So being able to write into that was one of the sources of my healing. Being able to hold those memories, like make them visceral, was healing. Also, I think I felt as if I was sharing this with other people, I might feel less alone in it. Although grief, of course, is, as I know a very lonely experience inherently, but especially when I was walking around as this representation of other parents' fears, there was an alienation. So this kind of helped me know that sort of someone out there is going to maybe bear witness to the insides of my despair.
Hmm. I'm so glad that you had the opportunity to write in that way that just felt natural, felt comfortable, like the connection had never been broken.
Yes, and it's so interesting. I mean, if you were to read the first drafts, I don't think anyone would really want to have. I had to kind of, that was just sort of almost free venting. It was just sort of a release of the pain. Another one of my motivations as a parent, and I think it's because I've spoken to the fact that, in Reaching for Beautiful, there's a thread about addiction, and my father was an alcoholic. I'm in long time recovery from alcoholism. And then my son Christopher ended up becoming an alcoholic. And perhaps by virtue of my father's alcoholism, he ended up dying of it. I didn't feel that he was particularly capable of demonstrating the kind of love and affection that I wanted to be able to be sure I provided to my three children. And so this motivation was, can he feel, I want to make sure Chris feels my love wherever he is. And it felt sort of just incessantly necessary.
I have not personally dealt with family members with addiction, but I have friends who've dealt with it, or friends who deal with it with their own families. And what would you say to someone who's going through something difficult and wants to support another person who's going through that?
One of my greatest life lessons, and I try to impart this, and I don't know if I do it successfully in my memoir, but is when anyone is impacted by the addiction of a loved one, there is almost no way they can find themselves without fear. We're living in a world now that is fear filled, and most of us that are parents fall into, the trap of so much fear in relation to how our children are doing. And then if addiction is playing a part in that, the stakes get really high. And so when there are life and death stakes, we can become riddled with that. And I think for a long period of time, especially in hindsight, I could look back, and because Christopher was such a pistol and he had me in chase mode, from the get-go, trying to kind of keep up with him and make sure that he wasn't getting into something which was almost impossible to prevent. I was in this state of fight or flight. And then once he had a period of sobriety, we were able to intervene and get him supported, and we had to send him away to make that possible. And we were privileged enough to be able to afford to do that. And addiction, particularly when it reveals itself early, um, it's a roller coaster ride. And and so there are ebbs and flows to it, and you're sort of just reaching for, grasping at straws. But we were so fortunate that we found a path for him that effectively was able to garner him a period of sobriety and a period during which he was happy, he was able to just become his very best self, which was an extremely open-hearted, compassionate leader. And so he then in turn was able to help other young men who were trying to maintain their, get sober and stay sober. And that was a beautiful period. But that during that time, it taught me to begin to, an easier, right, when I knew he was in a safe space, to try to let go of fear. But the interesting piece was that as soon as I had really gotten to a place after that 3 years, he then wanted to come home and go to college. And, he had been sober from 16 to 19. And then he wanted so much. He was really, throughout his life, wanted to be like everyone else, although he was special. And he was special in terms of his free spiritedness and attention deficit. He was special in terms of the fact that he had some learning issues. So, and I think that was another thing that as his parent, the fight or flight, my own experience being raised as the daughter of a volatile alcoholic father who felt different and ashamed, was to try to spare him that. What I ultimately came to recognize was that there should be no sparing, that we're all here to live our own life challenges and experience pain in order to grow and evolve. So he goes back to college and he, is drinking and using drugs again because he's thinking, oh, wow, I've had this period. I think maybe I can pull it off. Well, the truth is, he wasn't really pulling it off, but he had this incredible next chapter, which was to get to be right in the thick of a quote normal experience of college and brotherhood with his fraternity brothers. And again, he was so meant for brotherhood. He'd sort of formed a lot of camaraderie and leadership with young men when he was away at his therapeutic boarding school, and then found that again in college. And so I was in this process of, even though of course I was concerned that he was, being as reckless and wild and not ever thinking in terms of the second beyond the moment that he was in. Of course I was concerned, but I was really consciously working on getting supported around relinquishing fear, because what I came to be taught, and I think Christopher was here to teach me, was that if I was in fear, if I was in the chase, if I was trying to control outcomes, we couldn't have the kind of sacred connection, and I couldn't be as present and available to him as I could otherwise be. And that's where it's at. We sustained a really loving relationship during that time because there was greater letting go and also acceptance of who he was. And then he dies, right? And so when I'm faced with and writing about and trying to find some meaning in what's happened, it's like, oh, I remember asking myself the question, am I was I should I have stayed in fear? Should I have, like, perhaps locked him, because that would have been the only way to have, I couldn't rein him in. Is there someone trying to tell me something that perhaps I shouldn't have let go of my fear? And in fact, no, I was pretty quickly able to see that absolutely not, that our task as parents, as humans, is to take care of ourselves in such a way is that our fear, which manifests in control, is not conducive to the kind of relationships that we want to build with our children and with anyone else. that we love. We have to let, and it's really been something I've continued to, and I will probably the rest of my life continue to have to work on, because I have two living children, and one of them whom I've experienced similar kinds of concerns around. But I know that he's got to find his own way. And really my only job is to love him and to guide him and to sort of help him know what if he solicits my feedback, which isn't something my children tend to do, um, I can certainly advise him when and if he does, or if she does. And it's been interesting because my daughter is 28 and is just now getting to a place of looking to me, because they have to kind of do everything. At least the McQuillens tend to need to do things the hard way.
I was wanting to know how you decided to get into psychotherapy and what is something that you enjoyed most about that career.
I love what I do, and it's so interesting to me. I was working in marketing out of college. I started in public relations and then continued in various forms of marketing. Then at the age of 25, my life took a significant turn, and that's when I was able to stop drinking. When I was beginning to help other people as part of my recovery process, it was so fulfilling relative to some of what I was doing, pounding the pavement in my career, that I decided to go back to school and get my master's in social work. I loved it. I just took to it like I just took to it. And particularly given my background, my childhood, my family of origin, I do think that some of us enter the field in order to put our own pieces together in part, but then I know that I'm naturally caring in this way, that this is my orientation. And so I get my master's in social work, and then I not, in fact, very promptly am expecting Christopher, and was morning, noon, and night sick with him in my tummy, and had been offered a job at one of my field work placements in a community mental health center in a substance abuse section. I had to say, I'm so sorry, I'm not going to be able to take this job because I just can't even function. So they actually wanted me to come back after he was born, but he was colicky, and I was trying to determine what made sense if I'd had to pay for care. And I was sort of comparing that with what I'd be making. I mean, the whole thing didn't make sense. So I then had this beautiful gift of being able to be essentially a full-time mother. And time just passed. And then I went on to have two other children, and I did a variety of creative things. I had little businesses where I did so many different things, Tammy. And I think it was because I did need to have something outside of the work of a parent, which, albeit so incredible, I often felt like I was failing at or not good enough, and I think that might be the plight of most mothers. So I had different things that I did that were creative. I had a vintage jewelry design business. I did decorating people's homes. I taught preschool as my kids were getting older, and I ended up, they were sort of moving forward. I ended up having the beginnings of my midlife crisis and asking myself, what is my calling? I thought, how was it that I could have let go, let my social work license lapse, and it was time to restore it. It took me some work. I wouldn't recommend letting a license lapse. It took me some work to, regain my license. And then I sought my specialization in substance abuse. So I'm an LCSW with the CADC. And I laughed about that because I thought, oh, aren't I already specialized in this? But I became professionally specialized in it. And then I thought, oh, should this be something that I direct my attention to? Is this just too much? I actually felt like as long as I was doing my own personal work, I'm impassioned by this. And it's so interesting. So then I've renewed my license, and I'm working in the field. I'm working in an outpatient addiction center, and I want to be able to ultimately go into private practice, which had been my plan all those years before. And Christopher was so proud of what I was doing, the way that I was helping other people. When he died and I began my private practice shortly thereafter, I really felt, I still feel, as I'm sitting here at my desk, like he is in it with me. One of the many questions that I was wrestling with as a bereaved mother was, what is my purpose? And sinking my teeth back into my work was another, and the writing, these were means of surviving this and sort of staying centered in something, having a mission to serve and help other people and do what we're meant to do, it's sort of like kind of surrender to what it is we're meant to do was really hugely helpful for me.
I'd love to touch on that last point about surrendering to what we're meant to do. I mean, I remember going to music school and I knew I wanted to do something in music, but I didn't know exactly what. So, I collected a couple degrees, bounced around majors until I figured it out. But I feel like maybe our heart and our gut knows. It's just a matter of figuring out, like, following that compass.
So true. And I'm saying it sort of, maybe I always kind of looked back at my having bounced around, and I think I'd felt like, oh, I would have been more successful had I known, I look at, I have a nephew who's a doctor, and he knew when he was a baby, I mean, literally as soon as he could talk, he knew that was his mission, and I believe it is. But it took me time to, I'm ultimately so grateful for all of the life experiences and the creative endeavors. Even when I was briefly working as a preschool teacher, it was particularly since, Christopher had been on the run since he was 9 months old, and each of my children were fairly busy. I felt like I didn't have enough of that babyhood time. So I almost got each step of the way, the different pursuits filled me in some way that needed filling. And then you ultimately kind of peel everything else away and you know what's at the heart of you.
Did you ever imagine that you'd end up writing a book that could help others?
I really hadn't gotten that far. I know that there was, for me, when I look back in college, I was also a dance major. So again, there was this creativity piece to me. And then it was funny when my kids were in middle school, there was a benefit that I participated in as a parent where we put on a performance for the kids, and so I was a choreographer again, so some of these pieces of me, and I think about those as a source of comfort. Creative expression helped me feel restored to safety, and I recognize that I am creative in my work as a psychotherapist because I'm pulling from any number of different theoretical models, different things that I think will be helpful to the people that I work with. And it is interesting. A percentage of my clients are in recovery from addiction, but probably a higher percentage of them are in relationship or have been affected by other people's addictions. And then, of course, I have some people, I also went on later after Christopher passed to get a certification in grief education. So I do help people who are grieving losses, as well. But then I find, and the two of us were touching on this a little bit, that grief is such a through line for us in our lives any which way. So now that, of course, it's on my radar, I see it in all of the different ways that it comes into play.
I love what you mentioned recently about how creativity created a safe space for you. Would you be comfortable talking a little bit more about that and the importance of creativity for mental health?
Absolutely. I love that. I know for me, having been traumatized on a number of levels, what happens in grief too is that any any sort of previous wounds, sort of start to dance. And so any losses, it's cumulative. And to have such a loss as this, it just brings all losses to the fore. And so there's that sort of underlay of trauma. But there was for me, this other really big brick of trauma, which was I could not be there when my son died. I didn't know I had created a narrative in my head about what kind of suffering he might have experienced, and I could not be there to comfort him in that moment. And I needed to really utilize all of my resources to come through that. And that included, my regular therapist and then a specialized therapist in EMDR therapy to help me sort of rewrite the narrative that my fear created and come through that. So I was very conscious of not feeling safe. My son had left my home and this happened. So I found myself as somebody who's typically very social and people oriented, just as Christopher was, not wanting to venture out, developing some social anxiety. Um, and as a therapist, I knew how essential it would be to take care of myself far better than ever before. I've always preached, self-compassion and taking care, but to do it myself, this was like it became necessary. So I was very much mindful about what gave me a feeling of security and groundedness and safety. Creativity, it does that. It kind of takes us, we were talking before about what's at the heart of us. It brings us back to our own essence and spirit, that which is childlike and pure and innocent. This was sort of an innocence losing experience. And so to kind of get to a place where my faith could be restored meant writing, it meant giving, it meant striving to keep my heart open. I don't know if that answers the question, but for anybody who's suffering to be able to reach for beautiful, it's about trying to find the light where we're in such darkness that it's hard to imagine that will ever clear.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm so glad that you were able to find things to grasp a hold of and self-care monumentally important, not just through the difficult times, but on a regular basis.
It's so true, and a good part of working in addiction is, and I think it's interesting because a lot of times I hear myself with my clients saying something like, for addicts, oh, wait a minute, for humans, we need structure. So we need to kind of build in the discipline of some, essential self-care practices and maintain those as a building block, not just to sobriety, which is foundational to well-being, but to be able to have access to all that is good, to be able to actually experience joy as well.
What would you say to people who are interested in getting more into self-care, but they don't know where to start?
It sounds so fluffy, doesn't it? And it's like so many of the clinical terms that are now. Look, I love the fact that mental health issues are becoming much less stigmatized, but along the way, all of these catchwords like self-care, you almost wouldn't know what it means. You know what I mean? And so it's sort of like you do start with those basic things that are sort of like, and those are the kinds of things that I sometimes can't help but attempt to mention to my children, even though I shouldn't, which is, yeah, mom, of course I need to get a good night's sleep or, have a consistent sleep schedule or fuel myself properly or get my exercise. But some of those things, those are the first things to go out the window in crisis. And so to be able to start to put those pieces into place. So there's those all of those really basic pieces of self-care. The other thing for many of us, especially in the helping profession, is to remember to put our own oxygen mask on first. So many of us are also meeting demands, whether it's professionally or personally, of so many other people. We can't sustain that without ensuring that we have certain disciplined practices. So that can also include, meditation. It can also include conscious contact with the higher power. And then it can also include creative endeavors and play. It can include self-help, support groups, therapy, specialized therapy. But through all of it, learning to talk to ourselves much more compassionately is really important. Many of us, and myself included, and I did this in grief and still sometimes can, have expectations that I'm supposed to be somewhere that I'm, like not necessarily sort of, again, surrender to um, the painful pieces or the mess of it all, and not have to sort of, you know, steal through it. Instead, lean more into the pain to be able to come out the other side.
I'm just reflecting on your answer and processing it. Self-care is something that I'm very much aware of in my practice as a music therapist, but also in my personal life. And I remember having to like work through what self-care meant to me personally.
Yes, right. And it's interesting, with your music, music is another part of my self-care. It actually brings me closer to my son. It's always, even before I had the tools to be able to check in with myself to see how I was feeling, it has elicited feelings. So, anything that elicits feeling to me, anything that makes energy move is really, really helpful. And that was one of the things that, I got this great exposure to energy healing after losing Christopher and appreciating, there was a period of time that I experienced this energy shift, and it was related to my loyalty to him had me feeling guilty if I did have even the tiniest moment of respite from the pain. And then remembering that he wants me to have, I'm here to carry out my purpose, to grow, to serve, and to make him proud. He wouldn't want me to be, it doesn't mean that, he wouldn't understand the times when I do get ambushed by my grief and am filled with missing his physical presence. But yeah, so there's so many different things: music, writing, whatever those might be, dancing, whatever those might be, that also move energy.
That's excellent and such a great point. I love that your book is a resource for people. Obviously, that was not around until you wrote it. So, what books or websites have helped you on your journey?
Well, it's so interesting because during the period of time it took me 7 years to write Reaching for Beautiful, and when I first began to write it, I didn't think there were that many grief resources. I read Joan Didion's, A Year of Magical Thinking. I went to C.S. Lewis, and this is a specific resource for those who've lost children. I think it's Martha Hickman writes their daily essays that were so imperative for me to be able to just read and hold on to in the acute stages of my grief. But since, of course, COVID has happened, and that incited much more grief awareness. Still need to get better at it. We're still not really as comfortable as we could be about grief. We don't know how to approach it. We tend to run from it. And so that's part of what I'm hoping will happen as I share more about, because unfortunately, regrettably, there are way too many parents who've lost children, whether it's to the increasing suicide epidemic or opioids or whatever it is. I am not alone. And so we need to resource ourselves really well. David Kessler, who's a renowned grief expert, was helpful to me. He's the one who led my grief education certification. Increasingly on Instagram, there's so many people who are available to help.
I'm not a huge fan of social media, but I must say there are certain therapy accounts that are just, whether it's on relationships or grief, that are impactful. And I think the younger generations are becoming more mindful about mental health and the importance of therapy, the importance of taking care of their mental health, like breaking the shackles of shame, so that at least it seems, or it appears to be, that people are proud to say they have a therapist, whereas a long time ago it wasn't that way.
I am so thrilled about that. And I did observe that in my private practice, that there were people coming to me who'd never before sought help. What a privilege to be able to work with them. And I do. And I think we have to be discerning about our input. So that's another form of self-care, isn't it, Tammy? To
Mhm.
be really mindful, because social media can be really overstimulating, and it can make even those of us who think we know better fall into, be susceptible to, like comparison, which is such a thief of joy. So I think being really discerning about who we do choose to follow and how much time we spend doing that. But again, finding your people who give you what you're looking for, whatever that fit is.
Excellent. Well, Sally, thank you so much for joining us. I've got one more question to end us on. What I'd like to know is, what type of legacy would you like to leave behind?
Ooh, it almost makes me feel immediately emotional.
Mm.
I have thought about that, and I really think that Christopher's message to me, he tweeted about a month before he died: life is honestly so beautiful as long as you allow it to be. And that helped form my title of Reaching for Beautiful. My legacy would be to always choose love, to have been loving at every opportunity, to keep my heart open, even when there have been times I've wanted to protect it and armor it up. If I've been able to be just as open hearted and embody Christopher's love life, just big, bright, sunny spirit, then I'm doing okay.
Excellent. Sally, thank you so much for sharing your story, your son's story, your family's story, and for writing the book, Reaching for Beautiful. It's out, so please check the show notes if anyone's interested in checking that out, checking out Sally McQuillen and her website. And as always, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Creative Piecemeal. We hope today's episode left you feeling inspired. This podcast is independently created and produced by the host, Tammy Takaishi. More details about today's guest can be found in the show notes, along with links to the podcast's socials, merch store, and ways to support arts organizations AHA Broadway and New Normal Rep, both near and dear to Tammy's heart. Don't forget to visit creativepiecemeal.com, the official podcast website, where you can leave fan mail, write a review, explore Tammy's blog, and discover the growing collection of episodes. Special thanks to our audio engineer, Alex Rapetti. Additional narration by Dante Jace. Let's keep celebrating creativity in all its forms.